So, a very warm welcome to this fifth webinar in a row in this Kill Corona by Getting Smarter series of webinars, sent directly live to you from the makeshift TV studio in my dining room. So yeah, technically we could have a lot better quality, but hopefully the content can compensate somewhat from that. Today's topic is you could say is quite relevant because it's about how do we communicate change, and also I'm going to talk also about what is change, because let's face it, right now we are all facing so many changes that most likely a lot of people will end up with also having stress from the situation simply because there are so many things changing around them and it's out of their own control. And this is one of the things that always influences people, is if you put upon them a change in your organization and you don't give them any influence, and they just have to sit and wait for the consequences. And this is unfortunately what happens most often when organizations do change. And when I say organizations, you can transfer that into whatever kind of organization you want to look at. You can look at it from a political spectrum and say a country is an organization where you have to do change. So politicians are definitely running change. We have organizations running change. We have companies running change. We have departments. We have teams running change. And you also have on your sports clubs, teams, you have change. In your families, you have change. Changes all around us. So we cannot avoid change. Now, I was thinking a lot on my morning run about change and like, okay, right now we are in what we could call a global crisis, and I'm sure we haven't seen the most yet, because all the repercussions of this will come. However, there is always positives. One of the things I noticed was that now they're showing pictures of dolphins in the canals of Venice, because suddenly the water is clearer. In China, I'm sure that many people for the first time in their life is actually seeing the sky. So we are now exploring new ways of collaborating, and maybe that can reduce the traveling a little bit because people get more used to working with these distance medias. So change always has good things with it, and there are always something which some people will consider negative. Now, we are in a current situation where for sure there's going to be negatives. However, there's also going to be people coming out on the other side with even better, smarter solutions. And this is what we've seen with change ever since, the early day of the planet. Some of the richest people in the world actually made their fortune during the financial crisis in the 20s in the US, the Rockefellers, etc. So change is not necessarily bad. On the other, actually, it's quite good. But it can have consequences, and when it's ongoing, it for sure can be felt and have a negative impact, unless we do it smarter. Now, I'm not talking about what's going on right now, because this is not really something we can influence that much, at least not you and me, but I'm talking about it when you want to run a change in your organization. That's where we can do things smarter. Let's just have a little bit. I'm going to put on my sharing my PowerPoint here. Oops, if I can get it. There we go. And hopefully you are able to see it. And now, what we need to do is we have to generate buy-in in the receiving group, as that means in our target group. And then we also have to crank up the motivation for the change we want to happen. So one of the things that we have to think about is that there has always been change and there will always be change. Again, sometimes controlled change, sometimes not. If we look at the universal cycles of change, and you can kind of take that into any context that you can think of. First, you have the creation. Now, I put a tree in there just to exemplify. So you put the seed in the ground, and then this tree will start growing. And gradually that tree will become more complex and more mature, so we actually have this beautiful tree. Then in the fall, there's going to start coming some winds, which eventually could turn into hurricanes, which would be the chaos. So first turbulence, which is a little bit of turmoil, and then the chaos. And then the tree decides, okay, in order to survive, I have to let go of my leaves. Because if I keep the leaves on, the wind will take me too much. So I drop off the leaves, and some of the old trees, some of the sick trees also will fall. So things will drop off. And then there's a resting period, and then back in the spring, more green things coming out, and then we run again. Now this is just a plant or a tree. Now if we think about the cycluses of everything you think about, it is there. You can take a car, you can take your work, you can take your relationship, you can take your company, you can take many things. One of the things that's been so much focus on the last years is the climate. And if you think about it, climate changes is not new, definitely not. And they have happened and they will happen for the next million years. Now, we talk about right now that there's no doubt that, of course, the pollution does have some kind of impact, and the experts are disagreeing and arguing, but it's a rather emotionally loaded debate. But if you think about it, we have had periods of time where the planet was covered with ice, and maybe that's going to happen again. Now, of course, we're trying to fight it because it's going to be quite cold and we're not going to like it, unless you happen to live inside the ice in Greenland. You might find it nice. But for most people, that would be a radical change, and there will be a fight to survive. But it has happened before, not just once, several times. So everything runs in these cycles, and the only question is how long is the cycle, and this is what we have to address as well. So one of the things that really caught my attention early on with change is I remember when I went to management school, and they talked about Kotter. And Kotter, he was the guy with the change management guru, and he said, well, there has to be a burning platform for change to happen. Well, maybe, but on the other hand, when you look at people following these advices and using this burning platform, they are almost scaring people into change, because that's when they start the change process, involve people in the change process, when their ass is on fire, so to speak. Even Kotter has now revised his approach, because we can see that if we, for instance, go to Japan and think about also the lean methods with Kaizen, where you're talking more constant renewal, rethinking, it becomes a gradual process instead of these major radical changes that scares people a lot more. So some of the things we're going to talk about today. Now, when we talk about change, there are three types of change. Developmental change, transitional change, and transformational change. And if we add a few words to what that difference is, the developmental change is when you take an existing process and you say, how can we make it even better? So you're talking about improvement. So you're not really changing so much, you're doing evolution on the existing process. Then we have transitional change, which is when you take an existing process, take it away, and insert a new one to do the same thing, but in a different way. So of course, this is more radical. And then we have the most comprehensive, which is transformational change, is when you reshape your business strategy and process. So this is, again, when you say, okay, yesterday I was doing this in my business, tomorrow I'll be doing that. Or you open up a whole new branch of something. That's transformational change. So transformation is much bigger, much more impactful, whereas the other things are more gradual and smaller, typically. So this is what the changes that we have, and these are the changes we have to address. And we have to think about when we are initiating a change. One of you here is a tennis coach, and I'm sure that you have your way of doing it. But suddenly you get a new idea on how to do it, and then you have your group in front of you, and they're going to go, wait a minute, why is he now doing it this way? Now, of course, if you can somehow inform them about it, they will be more happy. However, here's the interesting thing. We talked slightly about it the other day when we talk about mergers and acquisitions. And a lot of those mergers and acquisitions globally has been following the pattern suggested by Kotter in his theory of change, and has also been implemented by huge consulting companies like McKinsey. But both in Kotter's and McKinsey's own studies, they actually say that 70% of these major changes, because a merger and acquisition is a major change, they actually fail. Now, what is it that fails? Is it the strategy? Is it the idea? No, it's not. It is how we involve and how we communicate to the parties involved, the stakeholders, and predominantly the employees. This is where they fail. They take for granted that this is just something that has to happen and they will have to understand it. I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. And this is where we run into a little bit of an issue. Now, you have the change agent, and he's going to be singing a song. And then, of course, you have the poor employees at the other end, the victim of change, who will be sitting there and saying, oh, no, not again, or what's going to happen to me? So this is, again, where we're not necessarily thinking about the people that we are involving in the change. We're just, this is great, this is fantastic, let's go out and do it. And then, again, singing the famous Pointer Sisters song. So this is what generates resistance, because if we don't think about the people that we are communicating the change to, and if we don't involve them, then you're going to get resistance. And there are logical reasons, and that's what we're going to be talking about now in the near future. I'd like to do a little bit of marketing today and say this is actually based on a 3-day seminar. So it is just an extract. So we're not going to dive deep into the models. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what you need to take into consideration when you do communicate the change to the receiving group, the stakeholders, the employees. So let's have a look at it. So first of all, what we have to think about is also, we have to think about who's the audience and how mature are they. Because when you look at it, you can see that what we talked about on Monday, the motives, the intrinsic motives that drives us all, they don't change. Actually, from the age of 4, they're non-changeable. And then we have the IQ, which is changeable up until the age of 24, and then it actually starts gradually declining unless you're a nuclear professor or do a lot of Sudoku or crosswords. Values and beliefs can, to some extent, particularly in the younger people, change. But when we get to the older people, they are so embedded that they're not going to change. So again, you have to be aware what kind of organization, what's the maturity age-wise, and how is this influencing the values and the beliefs. And then, of course, we have the emotional intelligence, which is actually one of those interesting things that can be changed and developed throughout life. Now, skills we can always learn, and then we say, well, older people, they don't learn so well anymore. Actually, it's not because they don't learn so well, it's just because they have so much knowledge. So whenever they take in new knowledge, they have to double check with the existing knowledge, and that's why it takes longer, because if it doesn't match or doesn't fit that picture that they have, their brain's gonna go, wait a minute, until they're convinced. Knowledge we can always change, we can always improve, because we can read, we can watch television, although some of it is more misinformation than information, at least we get more and more. And the quickest thing to change is attention, but again, attention is easier to change in young than in older, but it's still definitely possible to change, and we gotta have the attention on what's there. So just to give you a little bit of clue about what you should focus on. So I'm sure that if you're addressing a group of young kids, they're easy to influence, if at least you can get their attention. And whereas if you go to a group of older people who already have their ideas and they're quite firm, it's not going to change so much, but you can still do it. Oops. Now, when you want to communicate the change, there is a very simple formula. And this is what people do not do well. First of all, there has to be a clear why. What are we trying to achieve and what are we trying to avoid? But here is the failure, the pitfall of pretty much all the people I've seen communicating change. And I haven't seen everybody, so excuse me if I'm stepping on your toes. But what most people forget is, who are you talking to? Well, if you're talking to the investors, to the stockholders, shareholders, then of course you're going to talk about what's the benefit for them. But if you address the employees and you start talking about that the change is good for the shareholders, they're going to go, and so what? What's in it for me? And they may not do it consciously, but unconsciously they will. So it's very important that when you are establishing the why, the change, then that you're very clear. Of course, you can mention that it's good for the company or necessary, and I'm sure that a lot of leaders will have to do that in the near future. But you have to then also address, how can you, my dear employee, benefit from this? What can you achieve, and what can we avoid for you? So that they understand at a personal level what's in it for me. Now, of course, if the CEO is addressing an organization with 10,000 employees, it's going to be hard for them to say in detail, but this is where it has to be cascaded through the layers to be more and more precise, because that will generate a better feeling of relaxation. I feel more comfort about what's going to happen. I may still be afraid of change, but at least I feel a little bit more comfortable because I understand what's in it for me. Then you have to list the things that will have to change. So what are the things inside this change process? So that's basically just a bullet list of the actions. And then you have to establish how. Again, involving communicating, the sooner the better. In the old-fashioned system, leadership or even the CEO would decide a change, and then they would go and communicate it and say, go do. It is not the best way of doing it. If you want to have people on your wagon, then you're going to go to their bus stop. And that's where they're waiting for you, not the other way around. And this is where it's a very important fact that you just have to go in there and say, okay, first we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that, and then we're going to do that. So that they understand the sequence. How will this happen? How will it roll out? And then you're also going to take into consideration that some people are very motivated by options as well. So what other benefits will this change have? Not just the direct ones, but what are the indirect positive side effects? So that also subsequently for you, dear employee, will have a benefit. So again, when you're addressing, remember who you're addressing. Remember that it's the advantage for those people you're addressing that is interesting, not about somebody else. That brings us then into what you do, because I call it the linguistic checklist, because we have to think about the language. This is again where people go wrong. They don't know enough about linguistics, and unfortunately that part is not trained in management schools. They don't know anything about it. Actually, when they talk about communication, it's more the theoretical aspects of communication, estos and passos and all these things, but we got to break it down into the more specific. And that's actually why we do it, the 3-day training, because we're working with the change messages that for all the participants, so that they can take a concrete thing and just create buy-in simply through the language and the way it's presented. So we have to go then step by step. First of all, we got to go with the most intrinsic part, the most stable thing, which is a dominating motive. Now, of course, that's going to be an assumption unless you have a profiling of all your employees, which most people don't have. But it's going to be an assumption about what are the dominating motives, and we can kind of guess, once we understand the motives better, we can kind of guess based on the behaviors people have. Now, let's take a couple of examples that will have a huge influence on how your target group will receive it. And we're going to go to the safety motive first. I don't know if you remember from Monday, those of you who were present, but the safety motive is if you are red, that means going to the right on the safety motive, then you need stability, you need security, you think very much about the risks involved, and you will evaluate the risk higher than the opportunity. You also like things to stay familiar simply because there is somewhere a fear of the unknown. Some people are actually claiming that the biggest fear in humans is the fear of the unknown, and some people are willing to kill themselves just because they don't know what's going to happen. So it is a big factor playing here. But is my target audience, on the other hand, at the opposite end of that scale, meaning going to the left into the blue zone? Well, then they're going to love change. They're going to love risk if they score far enough to the left. Now, here is one of the challenges, and that's why I had that little illustration earlier, because a lot of the people who are change agents working with change in an organization, they actually have a motive saying, I love change. And then they go out to the organization and they meet people who actually hate change because that changes everything and makes life uncertain. And then they go, isn't this a wonderful idea? And they go, no, it's not. So you have to talk to the motives of the receiving group, not from yourself. And this is so difficult in the beginning until you start understanding how to do it. And this I've seen in many trainings, because people keep talking from their own heart. You got to put your heart in it, so don't get me wrong, but you got to talk to the hearts of the receivers and what is their driving forces, not yours. Then we have to think about also, next thing, we have to map out the values, beliefs of the organization. And also the focus points. What is my target group focusing on today? Because sometimes we need them to focus on something else. But we got to understand where they're focusing, and we got to understand what are the contextual values and beliefs belonging to this. Once we do that, then we can start taking it from a linguistic point of view and saying, how do we then language-wise take that and use it to our benefit in how we address? And then, of course, you have to look at where does my change proposal challenge those factors? Because if it is a change, it will challenge the existing. It will. And that's just a fact. Now, once you've done that, then you got to look at, okay, what are the benefits for my receiving group? And what was the positive intention of the existing mindset? In other words, if you have a target group, even though you're not happy with the performance, I'm sure that they will go in and do their very best every day. So you're changing something, but you gotta keep that positive intention of the receiving group. So looking at the values, beliefs, the existing focus points, and the way they behave, what is the positive intention? What do they want to achieve by doing what they're already doing and maybe have been doing for a long time? And then you gotta make sure that your change can still support that positive intention. Now, sometimes that requires a little bit of thinking, because there has to be some connections. And sometimes they're not so obvious unless you start thinking about it. Technically, this is where we can also go in and use reframing, other things. Again, I'm not going to go into that level of detail today. We simply just don't have the time, because each one of those techniques can take hours to work with and explain and get into. So just to give you a little bit of an idea. Another important factor is the level of abstraction the change is happening on. Now, what is a level of abstraction? Well, going back to Gregory Bateson, and in the early days, he actually framed these 6 levels of abstraction, which some people today also know as the neurological levels. Basically, there are 6 of them. On the first 3, we are very operational in the mindset, and on the top 3, we are very strategic. And of course, where is your target group working? Where are we doing the change? And not only that, but another thing some people forget when they're organizing the change is that they are looking at one level, let's say the vision of the company, but then they forget that in order to do that, it also requires a change or adjustment of the skills and the values and the beliefs, etc., etc., etc. So we have to make sure that all these 6 levels, that there is this generative cyclus, that they, once you change on one, you have to make sure that it's aligned with the level, with the change of the other, or the influence on the other levels of abstraction. So this is something you have to map out. And of course, you have to also think about what level of abstraction is my target group on. If you're the CEO and you start talking about a new vision and strategy and big fancy words, and you're doing that to the people on the floor, they're going to go and start picking their nose or their ears while you're talking, because they're more focused on the fact that they need a new supply of washer number 5 for the machine they're operating. So we need to think about in the context we're talking, where are people, how should my address be done language-wise so it fits the group. And we cannot go too far. And this is what happens very often, that we basically talk past each other in the levels. Another thing is also is, what is the level of detail in my target group? Some people work big picture, and of course, normally, not always, I have to say, but normally the higher you go in the hierarchy, the more people look at the big picture, the more strategic scopes, whereas the lower you go, the more detailed people operate. That also means that you have to think about, in your addressing of the group, how much detail do I have in here? And the further you go down into the levels of your organization, the more detailed it has to become, because I need to understand, in order to feel safe, in order to feel secure, I need to understand in details how this is going to influence me and what I have to do. That's not necessarily as important on the higher levels. There are exceptions from this rule, because some people are at high level and still extremely detail oriented. However, typically the communication is still not necessarily addressing the issues on the lower levels. And then finally, we also have to think about how will this influence the daily work? And what will we do to give you the needed competencies to cope with the change? So this leads a little bit back to this with the abstraction levels, that once we change, that's okay. Okay, I buy into the change, but then I'm going to go home and worry, because how am I going to cope with the change? What do I have to change? What do I have to do differently? And how should I ever learn? Now, I'm old enough, unfortunately, to remember when suddenly this thing called IT appeared. It was in the 80s that we started getting personal computers into the office, and it made a humongous change. And I was young, not super enthusiastic about IT, but I actually thought it was a cool idea, and I started taking some classes. But then I was working with people who was 30 years older than me, some of them 40 years older than me. And for sure, they didn't embrace the idea of having a computer the same way I did. Now, some of them, a lot of places, they actually took the easy way out. They said, well, you don't have to learn it if you don't want to, which basically means we lost a lot of people in that process because they never learned. So instead, we should rather be saying, okay, we need to start teaching you what is a personal computer, what can you do with it? And not necessarily, and this was unfortunate in the beginning, it was about programming, which is not really that necessary, even back then. It was still programs running where you just had to input the data. So again, we got to think about what are the needed competencies to cope with the change, and you got to be upfront about that. So this is really some of the important things that you got to think about when you're communicating the change, because it is about reassuring people. It's about giving them the belief that, yes, okay, I really like the old way we were doing it, but if we have to, at least I know that I will be held in my hand and guided along the way. And if you don't do that, people are going to start worrying. And once they start worrying in an organization, they will start talking and they will start gossiping. And trust me, once you have this ravine of negative gossip, it's very hard to stop. So your task, if you are the change agent, if you are the leader, is to make sure that you do these thoughts before. Again, there's a lot more you can do. There's ways you can shape your message. You can build yes strategies, but you still got to look at who are the people I'm trying to convince about this. Who are the people I need with me on the wagon? And then you're going to ride that wagon to the bus stop and pick them up. It's the way it works. It doesn't work the other way around. And I think that's probably the core message of today is think about your target group, think about how this will influence them, address it, and one final word of advice, involve them. The earlier you involve them, the better. And it goes on all levels. There's a lot of good ideas everywhere in the organization, and if you think they only happen at the C level, for sure you're wrong. So hopefully a little bit about how to communicate change, hopefully some inspiration. This concludes the first week of webinars. We've done 5 in a row, and we have 5 more to go. So next week, we're going to be talking about team dynamics conflicts on Monday. And then we're going to talk about also accountability on Tuesday. And on Wednesday, we're going to talk about this weird thing, or not weird thing, because for some who are perfectionists, definitely it's not weird, but what is perfectionism and what is the fear of failure? Because they are actually combined, they are driven by the same forces. And then Thursday, we're going to go into the art of feedback, teaching you the cycles of feedback. And then, as I promised yesterday, we're going to end up on Friday and talk about how we get caught by assumptions, basically running through how does the brain create these. So I hope you find this interesting. And as usual, this recording will be uploaded to our website. And You are more than welcome to share it with others. Hopefully we can share a little bit of good thoughts, positive thoughts in these times. At least that's the intention with this. And I hope you enjoyed today's session. So again, as usual, we're going to close the recording and open up for questions if you have any. So just a second.